Thank you all for coming tonight for our final Wish You Were Here artist talk with Ed Kashi. For 2023, we'll be back for 2022, I'm sorry. 2023, we'll be back with another series. My name is Emma Rathie. I'm the manager of programs and exhibition production here at the George Eastman Museum. The Wish You Were Here series is now in its 22nd year and has always been generously sponsored by longtime member and friend of the museum, Thomas Tischer. We are grateful to have Tom here tonight, so please join me in a round of applause to thank him for his continued support. Thank you, Tom. This evening, we are delighted to have Ed Kashi back with us, back from 2008, doing another Wish You Were Here lecture. Ed is a renowned photojournalist, filmmaker, speaker, and educator who has been making images and telling stories for over 40 years. His restless creativity has continually placed him at the forefront of new approaches to visual storytelling, dedicated to documenting the social and political issues that define our times. A sensitive eye and intimate and compassionate relationship to his subjects are signatures of his intense and unsparing work. As a member of 7 Photo Agency, he has been recognized for his complex imagery and its compelling rendering of the human condition. Ed's innovative approach to photography and filmmaking has produced a number of influential short films and earned recognition by Picture of the Year International Awards as 2015's Multimedia Photographer of the Year. From implementing a unique approach to photography and filmmaking in his 2006 Iraqi Kurdistan flipbook to paradigm-shifting coverage of Hurricane Sandy for Time in 2012, Ed continues to create compelling imagery and engage with the world in new ways. In 2002, Ed, in partnership with his wife, writer and filmmaker Julie Winokur, founded Talking Eyes Media. This nonprofit company has produced numerous award-winning short films, exhibits, books, and multimedia pieces that explore significant social issues. Along with numerous awards from WordPress Photo, Picture of the Year International, ComArts, and American Photography, Ed's images have been published and exhibited worldwide. His works are collected by institutions such as the Library of Congress, MoMA Library, and of course the George Eastman Museum, among so many others. His editorial assignments and personal projects have generated 11 books, and so tonight I invite you to join us after the talk for a book signing with Ed out in the concourse. So his book, Abandoned Moments, A Love Letter to Photography, will be available for purchase in the museum shop this evening. And now, if you would please welcome Ed Kashi with me.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, George Eastman House. Tom, I better not blow this because I want you to keep on funding this. So anyway, so it's really great to be here. I mean, the George Eastman House is one of the temples of photography on the planet, and so it's an honor to be here. This evening, I want to share with you excerpts from my new book, Abandoned Moments. This book represents really 40 years of making and thinking about these kinds of images. The abandoned moment, for me, is a kind of something I discovered I went to Syracuse University, so not far away. I discovered as a photo student in London in the late 1970s, and it embodies this sort of principle or this idea that when I make images, these kinds of images, I'm actually not in control. I'm not looking through the viewfinder. It's absolutely different from, the 90% of the work I create, where I'm, as Henri Cartier-Bresson said, the decisive moment, where I'm being very meticulous and looking through the viewfinder and watching my edges and all of those elements of great composition in photography. This is something different. This is really about an alternative magic to making pictures, where when we're not in control, we can still create these, what I consider these incredible images. I want to share a short video with you, and then we'll talk about some of the pictures in the book. Right. So this is the image that really started it all. This was in Bath, England in 1977. I was, again, a photo student with Syracuse and studying photojournalism. And boy, you know, whatever that was, 40 some odd years ago, since then, you know, I've had the great privilege and opportunity to travel around the world and work. Most of my work is long-term, in-depth projects, documentary projects and photo essays. And so, but this work, what I want to share with you tonight is more about the process of how I make images and less about the issues and the content. And so when I graduated from Syracuse and I moved out to San Francisco, I was a New York kid. I'd never actually been west of New Orleans at that point in my life. And I got to San Francisco and I realized I was not going to get a job as a photographer, and so I started to hit the streets. And I look back at this work and I realized that it was kind of brutalist, especially in light of the way the majority of work I do, which is very sensitive and you know, trying to tell really important stories that often involve intimacy. But this work was really about, I look back and I think I was like just an angry kid and I wanted to shove my camera in people's faces. And so anyway, back then it was working in film, of course, and I was working a lot with the flash and working on the edges of light during the day. And when I look back on this work in comparison to now where I'm working with digital cameras, you know, my sort of hit rate was very low, and I was not making a lot of images to make successful ones. But so I was sort of scouring the streets of San Francisco, going to different neighborhoods, Chinatown, financial district, also getting to know this new city that I ended up spending 25 years in, actually. This is one of the last pictures I've made of my mother. This is in Florida. But this approach to photography allowed me to be very free and kind of more whimsical and take advantage of what I consider, one of the greatest qualities of photography is the sort of serendipity that can happen when the unexpected takes place. But then as I started to get into doing more, I would say, serious work, working in conflict zones and areas of civil unrest, this is in Belfast in Northern Ireland, this approach came in very handy because it allowed me to be a little more invisible. And in environments where by bringing the camera to your eye, it's almost like grabbing a gun, where you not only draw attention, you not only change the scene, but you draw attention to yourself. Shooting from the hip and working in this way allowed me more freedom, it allowed me to capture images and moments that I otherwise would not been able to capture. This is in Hebron in the West Bank from a long-term project I did on Jewish settlers in the West Bank. This is in Ankara, Turkey, where I was covering an anti-war demonstration. So, as time went on and in my career, and this is in Lebanon, in Beirut, the Lebanese army training, again, most of the time I was not making these kinds of images. I was working in a more meticulous way, but it was like another tool in my toolkit, really. So I had the great privilege of having Alison Nordstrom, who used to be the curator here, to write the foreword to this book. And actually, this is the second book she's contributed to that I've published. And I wanted to share a few in the course of this presentation, a few of the pull quotes from her introduction. I love working with Alison because, she sees things with a kind of depth and an intelligence that I don't quite look at photography in the same way. So I'm going to show you two sequences here. This is something I don't normally do, where I'm really like going under the hood here. So I want to show you two sequences that rendered images that ended up in this book. But this is literally like frame by frame the moments that preceded the image that I made. And in that moment, I did not even know I made an image that I thought was good or great. But so this is in Iraq in 2003. I went there a few times to look at Iraq post-Saddam after we invaded, and I spent a lot of time with the Iraqi police. And so this was one evening, we were on yet another patrol on the streets of Baghdad, and the police came upon these two guys. And so this is kind of how it played out. And again, I'm shooting from the hip. I'm not really clear what's going on. I don't speak Arabic. People are yelling at each other. They find a knife on one of the guys. Then they're starting to kind of rough them up. At some point, the commander, as I found out later, tells them in Arabic, stop beating them. There's someone from the media here, and so, which I thought was ironic afterwards. And anyway, I keep on shooting, I keep on photographing. It's almost like sculpting, in a way, but it's additive, not subtractive. I'm trying to figure out how to make sense of this scene. This image was interesting. Okay, now this is interesting. What's happening here? I'm also, in the course of making this kind of a scene, I'm making what I consider a lot of bad images. So anyway, and then this is the image that ultimately came out of this scene. So there's something about photographing in this way where you don't stop, you keep on looking, you keep on pushing yourself. This is another quote by Alison. All right, and this is the scene that actually produced the cover of the book. Of course, I had no idea back then. This is 2007. I'm in India. It's after a long day in the field working on a big project with National Geographic magazine. And we're in a rural area in Maharashtra state, which is where Mumbai or the city of Bombay is. And off in the distance, we hear this cacophony of sound. So, of course, I say to the driver and my fixer, okay, let's go in that direction. We get there. It's a small, tiny village, and they're having a celebration for Oh gosh, the elephant. Someone help me. The elephant god. That's it. Thank you. All right. And so anyway, so we ask for permission. They give me permission, and then I just start photographing. The scene is chaotic. Again, it's sometimes you enter scenes as a photographer, and it's very hard to make sense of what is going on, especially when you don't speak the language or you're not familiar with the kind of, in this case, this celebration. So I'm working through where people are looking at me, and I'm frustrated, and then this kind of emerges. I thought something happened there with the strange woman with the hat and the glasses. I keep on photographing. I don't realize I've made an image that I would end up really loving, keep on going, and then ultimately, thankfully, out of that scene came an image that I was really proud of and ended up on the cover of the book. As someone who works primarily on very serious issues, social issues, geopolitical issues. My approach to photography tends to be, I want to put myself in a position where the visual elements that I need to tell my story exist, and then try to make a great image out of that. And that's very different than just sort of wandering through sort of the chaos of life and trying to, and just sort of going with the flow. I like to say that when I'm in the groove with this approach, the camera's an extension of my body, and I'm in a kind of trance-like dance with reality. This is in Marseille, France. There's a workers' protest. These are heroin addicts in Warsaw in Poland. So most of these pictures come from my long-term projects. And as I said, this is a sort of an approach or a technique that I only use sparingly. This is in Nigeria, in the Niger Delta. Did a big project in a book on the impact of oil in Nigeria. I've worked a lot in Nigeria. This is in the northern part of the country, the Muslim part of the country. This is horse dancing in Pakistan. What I love about this approach is it frees me up. Again, that's so often I'm so serious in how I'm working and bearing down on a scene and really trying to make sense of it. And this is really more of a visceral approach to image making. This is in the Philippines. Again, back in Pakistan. Over the years, I not only shifted from analog film to photography to digital photography, but I started to use much less artificial light. This is from my project on oil in the Niger Delta. This approach, there's a certain kind of energy that comes out of this that quite often is very different than the more meticulous approach to photography. This is in Madagascar. And sort of a scene like this is in Marseille at the central train station. I was probably 3 or 4 feet away from this gentleman, and if I had brought the camera to my eye, he would have, he certainly would have continued in his life. He would have either said something to me or moved away. So again, this idea of working surreptitiously, which I've been thinking a lot about and I'm going to share some new images in the last few months that I've made. I'm sort of the photographer I've become. In some ways, I recoil from this approach because it is rather aggressive, actually. So this is one of the more recent images that's in the book. This is from 2020. I was in Los Angeles working on a big project for a Danish newspaper. And in this case, we were looking at the income gap in America. I'd spent the morning in Venice Beach in a homeless encampment, and then in the afternoon went to Rodeo Drive. And I noticed this beautiful golden light that was refracting off of the facade of this fancy shop, and I just sort of positioned myself and waited for something that I thought was interesting to pass by. And this is in Beirut, in Lebanon, through a car window in the rain. So I like to talk about this. It's interesting how, even though I am a visual artist and communicator, all of my work emanates from words. That, what inspires me, what gets my blood going are words, are phrases, are facts. And that's what sets me out on my mission to make images. So I'm going to share some new work here. Okay, so I'd say over the summer I did a couple of workshops in Dallas and New York City teaching this idea of the abandoned moment, and these are just some images from those workshops. And again, it was interesting to sort of revisit this approach after many years where I was doing it purely to make these kinds of images as opposed to part of a larger essay. This is in New York City. Also, I realized this is kind of like a Rorschach test working this way, because I'm literally just sort of walking down the street just waiting for sort of something or someone to attract my attention. And I realized that I'm attracted to people who seem to be disturbed and down and out. I'm attracted to sort of, young people, young women in particular. And I noticed that the way they look at the way they look at me, let me see, do I have an image like that? And then also just sort of the chaos of life. It's also striking to me, I've now done this work I was recently in Amsterdam for 2.5 months, how much people are absorbed in their phones on the streets. And these are from Amsterdam. This is in the Van Gogh Museum. And there you have it. Thank you. All right. I just blew through that, right?
What?
I just flew through that.
We do have time for some questions. We're going to try to find our mic and put up the lights, but if anybody has a question, we'll get the conversation started. Yes.
So I noticed that like all the pictures you showed, despite being kind of not really composed initially, like they seem to be very layered. And so I was just wondering what your process was, like looking at a scene before you take a picture.
Yeah, so you mean in this manner or in general?
In this manner.
Okay. Well, what I'm doing is I'm I sort of think of myself like an animal on the hunt, and I'm using all my senses, but I'm keenly observing what is around me and what is going on. I'm anticipating maybe certain flows of action, and often it can be just an individual person, the way they're dressed, the way they look. It could be like an emotion. I'm clearly, as I'm saying, this sort of idea of the Rorschach test, I hope you guys understand what I mean by that. Like kind of what I end up being attracted to, I think reflects what I'm interested in, or kind of what attracts me. So often when people are disturbed, that's something that will like catch my attention. Sometimes if people are dressed very flamboyantly, but then also I might notice a combination of things coming together. And so then I'll literally sort of shimmy myself or position myself, hopefully in a position where I can get that layered effect. And that's something I strive for in all of my work, is a sort of layered approach. But with this approach, I don't have control. There's a lot of bad pictures that are out of focus and are blurry, so it's a very different way of working. I hope that answered your question.
Great, right here.
I was curious what kind of cameras, and were they visible to the people as you walk around?
Yeah, well, they're always visible. Pretty much Canon cameras for this work. I've worked a lot with Leicas over the years, but Canon cameras, yeah.
Where do you hold the camera? We're going to do this one first, just because we have a mic. Sorry, and then I'll come right here.
Do we want to actually put the lights up?
Yeah.
Okay.
There we go. You're going up slowly.
So you said you really found your eye once you sort of took to the streets of London. what was it like transitioning from like photographing in an urban environment to then photographing conflict? And like, how did you do that?
Right. Carefully? No. I'm not exactly sure your question. I mean, whether I was transitioning from an urban environment or any environment, working in conflict zones, just requires a whole nother level of attention, especially today, because of the nature of asymmetrical warfare, where there is no like front line per se. I mean, but honestly, it's being very careful, making sure that the people I work with I can trust, and that they have a handle on the situation, so that when I say let's go there and they say no, I will trust them and I'll listen to them. Or when they say it's time to go, it's that kind of thing. It's but to do that work today, you need battlefield medical training now. Just for anyone in the audience who's interested in this, that a lot of editors will not work with you if you have not had some form of medical like emergency training, which back when I was starting, that wasn't even a notion. I mean, you just sort of threw yourself out there, and you hopefully were smart and safe and had some good luck. Yeah.
Okay. My question was, could you be more specific about this, where you hold the camera? How do you fade into the crowd? Do you just shoot and not focus at all?
Yeah. So I don't think I ever fade into the crowd. I mean, again, this is something I really noticed in the work. For the last 2.5 months, I've been in Amsterdam, and I was noticing how often I think I've gotten away with it, and people are looking at me, often scowling too. Basically, I hold the camera everywhere but here. It could be anywhere. And a lot of the times I'm just sort of walking down the street, just with the camera by my side, and just sort of observing, and then trying to time, get the distance right so the focus is on, and just time it so that, especially for like layered images, so that things come together. It's an interesting exercise. You might ask, why do I do that, right? No. It's a mixture. I mean, this approach is probably mostly manual. I might do some auto exposure, but it's mostly manual. Yeah, and then as far as the focus goes, it's manual. Yeah. And when I did this originally, when I first sort of discovered this in the 70s and then the 80s, it was all manual, of course, because those were the only cameras that existed. So there was a lot of, hyperfocal focusing, and I'm constantly doing that, figuring out, what's the distance I want to work from, and then there are times, like again, when I was just in Amsterdam, it was like, I want to be 3 feet away now, which was kind of uncomfortable, because then you have to get actually really close to people. So, yeah.
Did you go to Newhouse?
I did, yeah. They don't teach this at Newhouse, by the way.
Actually, I went to Maxwell, not Newhouse.
All right.
Thank you for coming. It's very interesting, and I've followed your work for a long time. I'm curious, most of the photos with the sort of abandoned moments process is everyday life on the street, and I'm curious why you don't seem to do it when you're in conflict zones or in other situations.
So, well, actually, no, some of the pictures are from areas of conflict or civil unrest. So I don't know if you caught that, but I would say the places I don't do this are interiors for some reason. But no, I've used this in pretty much every kind of situation, but very sparingly in interior situations, because quite often it's very intimate, and that means I've made contact with people to get permission to be in that space. So it's a bit of a different animal. But
I have a question about your like approach now that the book is out, because so much of the process of putting the book together has been culling through the archive, finding the images after the concept had been sort of created in your head and like massaged for a couple of decades. Like now, having been in Amsterdam, your relationship to this idea of being the invisible photojournalist, how that has changed. Do you feel like you've become more or less invisible? Do you think people are noticing you more or less? It's kind of a broad question, but your approach to making work now that the book is out, now that the concept is cemented, being in a new city.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Can I ID you? So this is Brenda Bingham, who I had the amazing privilege to have work with me for the last 6 years and helped birth this book. So she is very intimately connected to this work. It's a great question. I was a lot more self-conscious in Amsterdam doing this, doing it in a deliberate manner. And there were a lot of times where I was like, why don't I bring the camera to my eye? Because I'm missing really great moments trying to do this other thing, but I wanted to stay true and really sort of push myself. But yeah, it was interesting. It definitely, there were a lot of times where I saw something unfolding and in retrospect, where I missed it when I'd go back and download the work, and in retrospect, it's like if I'd photographed the way I usually do, that I might have actually captured those moments. But I really wanted to push myself because there's something very interesting about doing this. And also, as I've alluded to, there is something really aggressive in this approach. And I don't know. It's an interesting kind of dilemma that I created for myself in trying to photograph this way. Now, after all these years, after working in a much more deliberate way. But I don't know if I answered your question, but.
So you said that words are very important to you. When you're working on a longer term story, do you go out and take pictures and then make words from those pictures that are representative of your story, or do you start with words and then go take pictures and see if that works out?
Right. So the process starts with words because words represent facts. Words represent they create context. So for instance, when I learned that the Kurds are the largest ethnic group in the world without a nation of their own, that's it. I was in. Okay, and then you create a shot list. So how do you create a visual narrative? How do you create a visual story? Because it's different than writing. Right? Where you actually have to get yourself into the time and space where things happen. You have to physically be present as a photographer. And that is the biggest difference, quite frankly, from writing. Obviously, filmmaking is similar. And so the idea, what I was trying to express is that it's words that sort of initiate my interest in something or inspire me to investigate and look more deeply into something. And words create the context. So for instance, I just this week published something with Time magazine about the impact of heat stress on workers, like Nepalese workers who worked in Qatar on the World Cup stadiums. Now, if I showed you the pictures and I didn't say any of those things, it'd be like, oh, those are people working. Oh, they look like they're working in hot conditions, or those are people in a rural agrarian landscape. Right? But once you add the words to it, then it gives it more meaning. And quite frankly, that's the point of photojournalism, is that it's not just about images. And it's the same for, reality-based documentary photography as well.
Curious, did you try to get releases from any of the people in the photographs we've seen?
No. That would be tricky, though.
Hi. I wonder if it's this process has any role in your filmmaking and video making or in audio recording? I know you've been a real leader in the world of mixing medias and how that's kind of changed in that area maybe.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Well, I feel that probably 20 or more years ago, I started to feel a need to break out of the frame, you know, and I've been working video for about 22 years now, so I think there's just a part of me that wanted to be more fluid, more cinematic, to play with things more, you know, because again, having kind of been raised in the world of photojournalism, of, you know, Henri Cartier-Bresson and all the greats, you know, Eugene Smith and Robert Frank, on and on and on, what I realized is this particular work is more like Gary Winogrand, you know, like freestyling. And so, yeah, I just think, you know, I'm a complex mix of things. But ultimately, so for instance, like the work I just did in Qatar, there's none of this. It's very serious and it's very stable and, you know, very very composed, because I'm desperately trying to tell a story that I think is really important. So, you know, it's interesting. There are times where I don't want technique to get in the way of the message. And then there are times where I want to revel in the technique of photography because it's such a beautiful thing that is full of like all these surprises and all this magic. And it still is, even though we're making 1 billion images a day or whatever the hell we're doing. There's still a magic to it.
I'm curious, when you were going back through your work for the book, any of the images, whether you were making them, you know, in that purposeful sort of assignment kind of way or more in the style you're talking about tonight, do you see different things in your work now than you did at the time you made the images?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, it's always interesting to look at one's own work because we're too close to it in a way, but over time that relationship evolves. And you know, it's interesting. I really learned this working on big projects with National Geographic magazine, where, you know, you'd make literally 20 or 30,000 frames for a story that ultimately was boiled down to 14 pictures or something like that. And so in that process of, or on my large personal projects, you have to let go of a lot of images. And at the same time, in that moment, you're editing with a specific point of view or a specific mission. So you might exclude work, or you will see certain images because in that moment they're fulfilling a purpose, if that makes sense. So then when you move on from that and you see it anew, whether it's a year later, or a decade later, or 20 or 30 years later, it's like they've been reborn, you know. And especially in these projects, I've done a couple of other books where I've stripped my work or decontextualized it. It's like they're reborn with a different meaning and a different purpose, and it's really a fascinating process, you know. I love this quote, and I know certainly Brenda's heard me say this, but you know, by Don McCullen, great British photojournalist, where he's talked about how when he'd be lying in his bed at night in his country home in England, he would hear his negatives talking to each other. And ever since he said that, it's like, oh my God, that's amazing. And now that I've had the good fortune to live and work for this length of time, I totally understand what he means. And it's really true and that's one of the beautiful things about, and even if you've worked for 5 years or 10 years, you know, at some point, your work can transcend, you know, the initial purpose that you might have made it for.
So much of your work is street life. Do you ever shoot with an iPhone?
Yeah. Actually, I mean, I've actually received assignments over the last 10, how long has this been around? About 10 years, to photograph explicitly with the iPhone. And on the project I just did with Time, there were certain situations where the iPhone was the only thing that we could use. You know, like we wanted to, when we were taking flights from like Kathmandu to Doha in Qatar, and it was really quite moving, where 90% of the plane was full of young Nepalese workers who were going to work there. I obviously couldn't pull out like my big video camera or like even a Canon 5D, you know, so I used my iPhone, and the results are seamless in terms of quality. But, and there's also something else for those of you who are photographers in the audience. I mean, you know, one of the many beautiful things about photography is like whatever tool you use, it creates a different approach, right? Like if you work with a Rolleiflex, or you work with a Hasselblad, or you work with a Leica or an iPhone, you know, are you shooting square format, you know, rectangular? These are all, again, it's all part of the magic of photography, is that we can, you know, I fell in love with photography when I learned about Imogene Cunningham in the 1970s, and she was in her 90s, and she was still making pictures, and I was like, I want to be her. Like, if I get to live that long, oh my God, I could continue to do this thing that's so magical. It was like, poof, yes, I'm in. So.
Part two.
Go ahead.
We have a question.
We just have a conversation here together.
How much post-production do you do on your work?
I mean, very little in the grand scheme of things. You know, there have been a couple of like specific projects where I've had, you know, more Photoshop work done, but it was very specific. But, you know, 99% of my work is, I would say, pretty basic, you know, digital darkroom techniques, because, you know, I also work by a very strict ethical standard coming out of the world of photojournalism and documentary work. You know, I want people to believe in my work. I never want my work to be questioned. And the couple of times I have done things that are more manipulated, then I'm transparent about it.
All right, do we have one last question? Oh, okay.
I'm always hesitant when I'm walking the streets to take pictures without permission. How do you handle that?
I don't know. What's the jury say? No, I don't know. It's a tricky one, man. It's really tricky. As I've said a few times, I'm really, as I've been doing this the last few months, I've been wondering about this, you know, this issue, because the public is so much more aware of being photographed now than they were when I began decades ago. So much more aware, and more paranoid might not be the right word, suspicious, you know? So, but this is what I do, and it's just one of the things you need to overcome to create this work. You need to be willing and able to put yourself out there, you know, and take that risk. So what I'm uncomfortable with is that I hate the idea that I might upset someone, because they can't know that my intentions are innocent, right? You know, they can't know that. But so that's the one thing that I don't like about doing street photography, because there is a way where we're kind of not stealing, but, you know, we're sort of, yeah, we're being a little deceptive, and especially in this approach. But if you stop to ask people, then you just might as well do portraits, which there's nothing wrong with doing portraits, because once you stop the flow of life, then you've changed the scene, you know. And my whole approach is that I want to capture candid moments. I want them to be candid and raw.
I want to thank everyone for coming this evening, and just as a reminder, we're going to have a book signing with Ed over in the concourse. So let's please give Ed another round of applause for being here this evening.